Okay, let's get going. Welcome, everybody. I'm Judy Farvolden, Managing Director of Mobility Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth session of the Way Forward in 2023. Before we start, I wish to acknowledge this land in which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This event is being recorded and will be shared. Mobility Network at the School of Cities is an institutional strategic initiative at the University of Toronto. 2 years ago, U of T recognized that the sustainable movement of people and goods is a global challenge that can only be addressed by a cross-disciplinary collaboration among university researchers and further through collaboration with the public and partners in industry and government. Mobility Network, a group of about 70 researchers from across U of T's 3 campuses whose diverse interests span the broad scope of critical issues about mobility, is the University of Toronto's answer to that grand challenge. We've organized that broad perspective into 7 knowledge clusters. Of course, everything is connected to everything else, but this organizing principle shows our focus on key challenge areas like equity and inclusion, land use and economy, climate change and health, emerging new mobility technologies and services, and let's not forget freight and urban goods movement. We wrap that in the green circle to remind ourselves that transportation, mobility, and access is about people, about who they are and the needs and wants they have, and that needs and wants that generate their demand for travel. And that's wrapped in an outer circle that reminds us solutions must work within the constraints of our natural environment, our built environment, and our governance environment. So welcome to the 4th of 6 planned panels that will run every other week until mid-June. This session is titled Moving and Housing Multitudes in the Toronto Region. And with that, I'll pass it off to Professor Chris Higgins, our moderator. The chat has been set up for you to send your questions directly to the moderator. Please use this chat to send your questions to Chris. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Judy, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. Getting some feedback. Is that good? All right, there we go. So I'm Chris Higgins. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Human Geography at the University of Toronto Scarborough. And my research focuses on the relationship between form and function in cities, with the interest in mobility and accessibility, real estate and land value uplift, value capture, housing and neighborhood change. And I am leading the land use and economy cluster of the Mobility Network. And today I'm moderating this panel we put together on moving and housing multitudes in the Toronto region. The key motivating factors here are that Ontario is faced with a shortage of housing, and that needs to be met with dwellings of many types and affordability options. And in 2022, for example, for the first time in Canadian history, the population of Canada increased by more than 1 million people, many of whom will decide to call the Toronto region home. And that's only the beginning. We've had big forecasts for growth in Ontario and the Greater Toronto area over the next 10 years we need to accommodate millions of homes that need to get built for people that are going to come to the region. So the pressure is really only going to continue to grow. To that end, our 3 panelists are here to bring together their perspectives to a discussion about where and how should we plan housing to safeguard equitable access to the region's opportunities. They're each going to take a few minutes to bring their perspectives to this discussion. Then I'll moderate a panel discussion and we'll take some questions from the group. And as a reminder, that the chat is sent to come to me directly so that I'll see the questions and then pose them when the time comes to the discussants. And I'll introduce each of the panelists in turn. But first up is Nathaniel Baum-Snow, professor of economic analysis and policy at the Rotman School of Management, and he holds the Premier's Research Chair in Productivity and Competitiveness. He has research interests in urban and real estate economics, labor economics, and economic geography. His recent research includes studies about housing supply and affordability, and the causes and consequences of neighborhood change. So very excited that today Nate is going to talk about what is known about urban housing, housing supply, and transportation in US and Canadian cities, and the broad challenges associated with coping with that robust demand for housing and that we see currently. So I'll pass it off to Nate.
Great. So thanks a lot for the introduction, Chris. Yes, so I wanted to talk a bit about kind of where we stand in the GTA in terms of housing provision and affordability, and what the prospects are for the future, and what sorts of policy challenges and opportunities we face in those regards. And partly that also, I want to mix in a bit kind of where accessibility and transport enters in here. So I think one way of thinking about where Toronto is, and Vancouver too, today, is kind of cities in transition, right? There's very rapid demand growth for living in the GTA. A lot of that has to do with immigration, but also just the fact that the economy is shifting towards high-skilled services, and that's the sort of thing that Toronto does. It's an industry that Toronto is very strong in, and so there's very robust demand growth by firms to hire workers living in Toronto, and naturally a lot of sort of high-skilled and high-income people looking to move to the GTA as a result. And yet the GTA, like many cities in North America, most cities in North America, was built up as a city of single-family homes. And that means that it's very hard to densify in practice, that once you have neighborhoods built up as single-family homes, there's a lot of resistance to densification, even as demand growth is such that if you were to build anew, developers would choose to build condos and apartments, and people would prefer to buy condos and apartments because they would be more affordable, because essentially you'd be buying less housing. And instead, in a lot of neighborhoods, most neighborhoods in GTA, we're stuck with a situation where in order to get into that neighborhood, you got to buy a whole single family home. And the condos and that are available are mostly brand new or very recently built, and new housing also tends to be more expensive than older housing. And so that presents an affordability challenge. And I think, you know, a big part of this is the fact that if you were to build Toronto from scratch, you would want to build it as a lot of high density apartments and condos, but in practice, what's here is neighborhoods of single family homes. And that just makes it very expensive. And you look at sort of the world cities that are similar to the sort of city that Toronto is turning into, you know, New York, Tokyo, Paris, London, cities like that, they're dominated by both expensive housing and much smaller housing units than we have in Toronto. Now, the pandemic has given maybe a little bit of space on this, because what the pandemic did was increase demand for kind of less accessible housing, you could say, with the rise of work from home. People now are happier to live farther from work, farther out in the suburbs. And that's increased demand for space some, but in the neighborhoods where you're even more likely to have single family homes. I think we see maybe a little bit of reversal now on that, and the housing market is starting to turn around a bit, but nevertheless remains quite expensive. And I think, you know, if we continue with the rates of immigration we've experienced in the past year, which is what the government seems to have in mind for Canada, we should only expect at some point affordability challenges to only get worse again from where they are now. And so in this environment where land use planning is very hard to change and it's very hard to densify, you know, I think there's clearly this recognition now from various levels of government that this is a challenge. and that's moving in the right direction. But it's going to take a long time to densify the city, and I'm very confident that neighborhoods that are built up with single-family homes today are not going to see a lot of densification. Just the local opposition is too strong, and so the big issue is, you know, land development available for development is scarce, and maybe new land that's being developed can be developed more densely. We'll hear about the Downthry Airport site later today, and I think that's a great opportunity. And in some sense, Toronto is fairly lucky to have a few sites like this that can be developed from more or less from scratch in residential that many other cities don't have. And so one of the policy challenges is to make sure that that development goes in a way that improves the affordability of the city. Now, that does not mean that the new housing that's built has to be affordable, I would argue, okay? You know, I think there's a lot of consternation about all these new condo towers going up that with units that are selling for almost $1 million. I can understand the reason for that sort of consternation, but the thing to remember is that the people buying those units and any new units that are built, first of all, they have to pay a high enough price to justify the development of those units, and that price point tends to be sort of in the unaffordable range. But second of all, they free up units lower down the sort of housing quality distribution for lower income people to move into. And so one of the things that I think a lot of cities have gotten wrong is kind of forcing a lot of so-called affordable housing to be built at the expense of building more new housing overall. Because as you build more new housing overall, you give more opportunity for that lower quality, less expensive housing to become available for lower income people who benefit the most from lower housing prices. And so there's some good recent research that kind of points to this. I think another sort of policy challenge and opportunity is how we essentially make more land available for development by improving the transportation network. So one of the things that I've experienced a lot in Toronto is sitting in traffic, you know, the extent to which accessibility to downtown is important, I think has come back some since the pandemic, and making areas accessible to employment centers, either through better management of the road system or through improved transit access to densely developed locations, is something that the government can do to essentially expand housing supply and improve affordability at the same time as encouraging dense construction. So, you know, I think this setting is really appropriate because I see land use planning and the zoning regime as being inextricably linked to the transport regime, and because the demand for locations comes primarily from the accessibility the location has, and if there's a way to improve accessibility to locations that are kind of somewhat near to the places people want to go, like downtown Toronto, then that's a way of making more land available for development and ultimately improving housing affordability, some combination of that, and also allowing the city to accommodate more residents and accommodate the population pressures that Canada is facing. Okay, so that's kind of my opening statement, and I look forward to hearing from the others about their perspectives.
Excellent. Thank you, Nate. Next up is Tara. And Tara is an economic geographer, an associate professor in the Institute for Management and Innovation at the University of Toronto Mississauga and is director of its Master of Urban Innovation program. Tara's research focuses on the dynamics of innovation, economic development, labor markets, and technological change in cities. And her most recent work explores the relationship between housing affordability and economic development. Today, Tara will talk about the largely ignored economic development side of housing and the need for programs, policies, or activities to improve the economic well-being, quality of life for our community. I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thank you, Chris. And thank you everyone for attending, and I'm delighted to speak today. As Chris mentioned, a lot of my work does in fact look at the intersection between housing and economic development. Certainly the more recent work does that. But I want to do so in a way that makes sure we don't lose sight of the questions of equity and affordability in doing so. And that, of course, lends itself to thinking through some of the kinds of interventions that governments at all levels can sort of facilitate to ensure that, because the where of housing affordability and the availability of that housing matters. So left to its own devices, the market may in fact, through the processes described by Nate, squeeze lower income people out of the places where they most need to live, which is close to transit. So that's one of the things I want to sort of have in the back of our minds as I sort of talk us through that. So certainly the premise of this presentation panel is to think about the challenge that Ontario, and particularly the Toronto region, faces in terms of both population growth driven primarily by immigration in this region. There is in fact outmigration amongst people who are living in this region, but the growth comes primarily from immigration. We kind of think about the swaths of those, and the characteristics, demographic and otherwise, of those groups of people, and also unprecedented housing affordability challenges. And I would sort of remark two things. One, first, this is not a new problem in Toronto or in Ontario, albeit it is a worsening situation for many families. And two, it's not a unique problem. And Nate alluded to this as well. These very similar affordability challenges are faced by cities in North America and around the world. And they, and the particulars of and contours of those challenges are really shaped by the policy environment and the decisions made by both the public and the private sector. In fact, in today's New York Times, there's an article about the exodus of college-educated people exiting the US's largest cities, partly induced by the pandemic because of affordability challenges. So the affordability issue is not just for people in the lowest income brackets, but in fact creeping up through even sort of higher income groups as well. When we think about housing and its relationship to economic development, we recognize, one, that housing is in fact a sector that drives economic development, right? It's a sector unto itself with the real estate industry that creates jobs and generates wealth for the community or the city. We think about it in terms of housing as an indicator of the health and wealth of a region. We think about that a lot. That certainly comes out of the view that Nate sort of is described in his opening remarks about sort of, if we see housing prices as being high, that might in fact indicate that a place is doing really well. But we also think about housing as an important dimension of quality of life, as an amenity that attracts both people who are participating in the knowledge economy and others to enjoy their neighborhood and their community. And the real risk in all of this, of course, is that as housing prices rise, there's displacement and gentrification issues at play. And those are the ones, when we really want to think about the affordability question, that we really need to focus on a little bit. And as I said, the particular shape and expression of housing affordability is really shaped by decades now of policy decision and sometimes policy indecision and in investments made both by the public and the private sectors. Choices about what types of development are prioritized, choices about what kinds of housing is built or not built, that sort of shift primarily to condos, that accommodate 1 to 2 people in the downtown, automatically forces out potentially larger family units or multi-generational families. And there again, maybe potentially shifting those families into positions where they cannot access transit or other kinds of amenities, schooling being another one of those things, and whether there's supportive infrastructure in place. And for me, and amenities. And so supportive infrastructure is, of course, transit, and then thinking about the mobility piece of that, that's highly important, but it's also social infrastructure, schooling, healthcare, childcare, things that allow for people to participate fully in the economy, which is a thing that we would all want to see. And a lot of this comes from seeing housing as only and simply a market good rather than as a social good as well. And so from that perspective, we can see affordability is going to be staved off by just a supply, increasing housing supply. But that's a really deceptively simple solution and answer to the question of housing affordability. It's not just more housing, but rather where that housing is, what kinds of housing are included, what else needs to be in place, the amenities and infrastructure I just alluded to, what policy levers can be pulled, what models are helpful, what are the consequences if we build in particular ways, the intended or unintended consequences. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in terms of mixed use, where a lot of my more recent work on housing is focused on, and really what kind of city or region do we want? Do we want where we push people who are in lower income brackets out to the edges of the city, or in fact, do we want a vibrant city that allows for a more complete set of communities? And I think the Downsview example might address some of those issues, and we'll hear more about that in a minute. When we think about zoning, zoning is one of the tools that planners have in their toolkit to address these issues. We just saw a very lively debate over the shift from single family housing to the allowance for multiplexes across the city of Toronto. It's going to be a marginal, it will shift only marginally, I think, the ability to densify in those communities, but might in fact start to allow for some missing of what we call missing middle housing. But mixed use itself on its own, our evidence suggests in Toronto won't necessarily address affordability issues. Yes, it absolutely reduces sprawl and reduces automobile use. Yes, it can enhance active transportation, especially when well placed beside public transit. Yes, it can generate quality, high quality communities and vibrant neighborhoods. And yes, it can in fact increase economic development. But it might not, and in fact, our evidence says it does not preserve housing affordability, especially for lower income individuals, and especially in the absence of other kinds of policy instruments. So the active intervention of government to, in fact, ensure proportions of housing is maintained or provided in a more affordable way. And so I think there are some other models and instruments that the government can, local government particularly, can introduce to ensure that piece. And that's where that completeness comes in, is actually allowing for high quality housing for people in lower income brackets alongside appropriately sized housing for people across income brackets as well. And so here, I think it's important for us to recognize that, developments need to also think about other kinds of models of ownership, whether they be land trusts or cooperative housing, and also interventions such as using to the best extent possible things like inclusionary zoning, requiring developers to include below market rent units, and things like actually using existing tools like we have already, like density bonusing to their fullest, which can include things like affordability clauses, which aren't used very much at the moment, but I think would allow for a more fulsome set of availability, housing affordability. Sorry, let me just now tripping over my words. Using those kinds of policy instruments would allow for more affordable units to be available in the right places, close to transit, places that often get where those things actually get pushed out, despite our best attempts to do otherwise. And I'll stop there, Chris.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, next up, our third speaker, Derek Goring, is Executive Vice President of Development at Northcrest Developments, where he's responsible for master planning the Downsview Airport Lands project. He has 20 years of experience in real estate development with a focus on large-scale master plan developments in the GTA, and has had the opportunity to work on some of Toronto's most important city building projects. So for many years, Derek's been actively involved with the Urban Land Institute, and today he's stepping away from the big ULI spring conference at the conference center to talk about the Downsview project with us as an example of how solutions are trying to be applied in practice. So I'll pass it over to you, Derek. Derek, you got some slides. Are you going to share your screen?
Yeah, I'll share in a second. Thanks, Chris. And as the non-U of T person on the panel, I am a U of T alumni, so I know the secret handshake. So happy to be here and share my thoughts. In fact, a lot of my comments really build on what Tara was saying, and what I'm going to try to present is to use Downsview as a bit of a case study to show a way that the ideas that Tara outlined can be implemented in practice. And so the theme that I really wanted to focus on is about taking a holistic approach to this challenge. And I think if that's the one takeaway from my comments, it would be that is, these are really complicated urban challenges, and you really can't look at them in isolation because they are interconnected. And sometimes by taking a focused or narrow approach to some of these challenges, you can actually be making counterproductive decisions. And I think it was already referenced by Nate earlier, a very simplistic example of that is, people move far away from the city to get cheaper housing, but then they spend more of their time and dollars on transportation costs, and governments have a higher infrastructure burden. So we're not actually getting further ahead. And so I'm going to just really quickly show a couple of slides about Downsview, just to provide context for some of the comments that I'm going to be making. I'm going to share my screen. So Northcrest is a real estate development company, and we spend all our time focused on the Downsview Airport redevelopment. This is a map showing the site in the context of the GTA. And as you can see, it's sort of right smack dab in the middle of the Greater Toronto Area. The yellow lines are the major highways, the red lines are the subway network, and we've highlighted the green line here, which is the Barrie Go corridor, which runs right through the site. So this is primarily for context for those less familiar with the site and where it is in Toronto, but it's also gives a sense of the scale and size of the site. Between Downsview Park, which is already there, and all of the land in purple, which is the development land, it's about 800 acres of land, which is about the same size as the downtown. And the boundaries of the site, Shepherd at the north and Wilson at the south, is about the same distance from Bloor to Front Street in the downtown. Northcrest is responsible for the lands shown in green, which is the Downsview Airport lands. PSP purchased these lands from Bombardier in 2018. PSP is the pension fund that owns these lands and owns Northcrest. We're a subsidiary of PSP. PSP is the pension fund responsible for the pensions of the Federal Civil Service, the Armed Forces, and the RCMP. The lands in purple are owned by Canada Lands Company, and those are development lands which are adjacent to Downsview Park. And so together, the lands in purple and green represent about 520 acres of development land, which are being master planned as we speak, collaboration between ourselves and CLC. And you can see the subway stations and the line right next to us. But the next slide shows that even though we are right next to these 3 subway stations, the site is so big, we still have a last mile challenge to overcome in terms of ensuring that everyone can have really convenient and safe access to that public transit infrastructure. The Downsview Park station is the multimodal station that also has GO train service. And this is just a really high level preliminary massing diagram that shows the overall development over the 30-year build out. We're expecting and planning for about 40,000 jobs and over 80,000 new residents coming to this part of the city. So essentially dropping a mid-sized Ontario city right in the middle of the GTA, but leveraging all of that existing public transit infrastructure. So I just wanted to share that context because a lot of my comments are specifically talking about how we're taking a lot of the ideas and the theories that Tara outlined and putting them into practice at Downsview. And it's a very unique situation to have such a large site in a very urban area already connected to existing infrastructure. And so starting with that broad idea of affordability, obviously housing is a critical part of the affordability challenge. It's most people's single largest line item in their budget. And we do have an affordable housing crisis. So starting with that, one of the things that we're doing is ensuring we have a range of housing options, and that includes a bunch of different elements. So one is about tenure, so a mix of rental housing and ownership housing. It's about the types of units, so a mix of small, medium, and large units that accommodate lots of different types of families over time, as well as addressing different income levels and ensuring that there's both affordable ownership, affordable rental, market rental, market affordable, market rental and market ownership. and ensuring that the services are in place to support all the different types of families that will be there over time, from young children to seniors. The second important part of this is transportation, and transportation is usually the second largest item in people's budget. So by thinking about how we can reduce the need for private vehicles in the development of Downsview, we can further reduce the cost of living and improve affordability generally. And so that partly means really actively addressing that last mile challenge, and importantly, not just for people, but also the movement of goods. Increasingly important in urban environments is ensuring that package delivery can happen in a way that doesn't clog up the roads, and the infrastructure is well thought out to facilitate that, and making walking and cycling safe, convenient, and easy for people. In fact, easier than using private vehicles, and that is the biggest driver of walkability and cycling in urban environments. But if you are successful in doing that, you can build less parking. If you build less parking, you reduce the cost of the buildings in the first place. It reduces the time it takes to build the buildings. It reduces the carrying costs of units, both whether it's a rental or ownership. So you can further reduce the cost of living in a particular neighborhood if you can build less parking, but you can't build less parking unless you provide people with better options for how to get around. And then next is amenities, and this was touched on as well. So in order to be able to have a walkable environment, it's not just about having sidewalks and bike lanes, it's about ensuring that the things people want to go to are within walking distance and cycling distance of where they live and work. And that just doesn't happen by accident, but it doesn't usually happen at all. So most of the time in real estate development projects, the developer builds some retail and they just think about it as a space that needs to be rented, and whoever comes first or whoever's willing to pay the highest rent goes into that retail space. We're trying to take a much more active approach to ensuring that in the neighborhoods that we're building, we're actively working to figure out what are the daily needs that people need, and ensuring that those amenities and services are actually going to be located in the spaces that we're building. And that may mean that we're not always optimizing the rent of that retail space, but retail represents less than 5% of the total development. And if we can create really great, successful places that people really want to live and work, the theory is that will generate overall value for the project. So our objective is, obviously our primary objective is generating returns for the pensioners that PSP is responsible for, but they take a long-term view. So if we can create overall value, we don't always have to be isolating individual assets and optimizing them, because that doesn't always optimize the overall value of these neighborhoods. It's important to note that density is an important driver of making that make sense economically. Retailers are not going to be successful, and they're not going to come to these spaces if there's not enough critical mass of people that are going to buy the goods and services being sold in these retail spaces. So the amount of density per square foot or per acre that we build in these places is a necessary precondition to these complete communities where people can have access to all their daily needs within walking or cycling distance. And then next is about jobs and businesses. So creating economic opportunities for people to live and work in close proximity to each other, and even thinking about how matching housing affordability and the jobs that are created in a particular place to facilitate and encourage people living and working in close proximity. I mean, we're not forcing anyone to do anything. It's about giving people options and choices. But it really, true mixed use is about ensuring that there's jobs close to where people work or where people live, not just about putting retail in the base of residential buildings. And so stepping back a little bit further, really it's about creating higher quality of life and promoting health and wellness. And so in addition to what I've already mentioned, it's about convenient access to other types of amenities, some of which Tara mentioned already: parks, schools, community facilities, childcare, healthcare, These are, again, things that we have to actively work to locate strategically so that they're accessible and convenient to the people living and working there. And again, that doesn't happen by accident. And most developers don't have the critical mass in one place to even wrap their head around how you would go about doing this. But because we are going to be working on this site for the next 30 years, we're collaborating closely with governments, nonprofits, and other stakeholders to find creative solutions to ensuring that these things are delivered, not just delivered, but delivered in a timely way so that they're there in the early stages of development so that people can have access to them when they first move in, not 20 or 30 years down the road. We're also investing in social capital, which is really about relationships, sense of community, and the building of trust amongst people in a place. That improves resiliency, it improves safety, improves mental health, and that quality of life. And this is something that really got highlighted during the pandemic. Some communities were much more resilient and withstood the pandemic more than others. And a lot of that was around, how well you knew your neighbors, and did you have friends in the neighborhood that you can rely on and still spend time with and be outside. And so those are important things, even post-pandemic, because you never know what shock is going to come next. And we really want to create these resilient communities. It's also about encouraging things like volunteerism and opportunities for people to connect to each other through social interactions. And that's another important function of parks. It's not just about access to green space, but it's where people can mingle and get to know each other better. And then economic development, thinking about social procurement, local workforce development programs so that people from equity deserving groups can have access to some of the economic opportunities that get created through developments like this. Finally, things like accessibility are integral to creating welcoming and inclusive places. And more broadly, we're applying an equity and inclusion lens to the way we do development to ensure that that this is a place that's welcoming for everyone. It's about actively engaging local communities, including equity deserving groups whose voices are not typically heard in the development process, and ensuring that the input that they have, the things that they're looking for, the things that are important to them are actually delivered as part of these new large-scale projects. And ultimately, all these things are important. They're all interconnected, but we need to measure them. And so we're going through a process of creating metrics and targets on these things to track them over time and report on them, partly to hold ourselves accountable and partly to be able to demonstrate the benefits of taking this approach. So, Downsview has the scale, and we, because of the nature of our owner, have a long-term perspective to consider how all these things can work together, which is quite unique. This idea of creating a complete community, and we have the scale to be able to do that on the lands that we are responsible for. Most individual developments don't, and governments actually don't have the amount of control that they would need to be able to do this. They have some levers that they can pull, but a lot of the things that I talked about today are not within the control of government. So it's kind of an interesting and unique situation that we're really trying to demonstrate how things can be done differently. So that's the high-level overview and the practical implications or approach that we're trying to take to some of these challenges that have been identified, and happy to get into the discussion.
Great, thank you, Derek. Thank you to all the panelists for that overview, and we can jump right into some questions now. And a reminder for other participants, if you have a question, feel free to post it in the chat and it will come to me. But to sort of start at a high level, just taking a lot of notes from everyone's talks, that it just seems like we have a lot of really big key challenges to address. And I don't know, again, starting at a high level, what do you think the region will look like in 10 years? Maybe in an ideal sense of how it should look versus maybe what we'll realize, but there's just key challenges about getting housing built, where and how that housing gets built, how densifying, but how to make that density livable, and drawing on from Nate's comments, for example, how to make that development accessible as well. Like, is this a challenge? Are we up to this challenge in the region? And just a general question before I jump into specific ones, but anyone
I guess I could maybe start off. So I thought what Derek said was really interesting, and maybe is kind of the exception that proves the rule, that what you have in the Downsview Airport site is the opportunity to kind of optimize in lots of ways that we can't in most other situations, right? Where we know from a policy perspective that it makes a lot of sense to densify this neighborhood, say the DuPont corridor, for example, which I see every day coming to work. And yet then you have all these independent developers building there with and having to interface with various other levels of government, whether it be Metrolinx and the city and the railroad or other, all these other landowners and each other, to try to generate a high amenity neighborhood that's going to generate the demand that is high enough to justify building dense in the first place, at the same time as managing the interests of the incumbent residents nearby that will face the extra traffic congestion and the crowding in the schools and all the negative things that come with densification. So you in the Downsview Airport site can kind of can fix all of those problems because you have control over everything, and that's really great. And it's kind of this is what shopping mall developers do too, right? They have the anchor store that they basically give free rent to, and that allows them to maximize the value of the place by through the shoppers that are drawn in through the anchor stores. That most development that's going to have to happen to densify the city and accommodate the additional population demand growth for the city can't happen that way. So I think from a policy standpoint, we got to think about who's going to be coordinating everybody to try to achieve these same goals when there's so many different interest groups involved. And I think the Ontario government is actually kind of trying to do this, but they make a lot of enemies. And in order to really do this effectively, you got to be pretty heavy-handed. And I don't know if there's a good example of where that's actually happened anywhere in the world. Maybe in China, actually, there's been some examples, but there are some people that are definitely hurt pretty badly by going in and completely clearing out a neighborhood, which is what they've done in big Chinese cities, and basically saying to people, okay, you can come back in 5 years, we'll give you some temporary housing, and we're going to densify this, right? Like, that's just maybe off the table for Canada, but to really densify and to make Toronto look like Shanghai, that's what the sort of thing you'd have to do, I think.
I can make a couple comments in response to your question, Chris. One is that I think adding lots of supply of housing is necessary but insufficient to solve the problem. I saw a couple stats recently about how Canada has among the lowest rates of government housing in the OECD. Like something like 5% or 4% of all housing is somehow subsidized by the government, and there's European countries and other places in the world where it's much higher. And so regardless of how much housing we build, again, it is necessary for us to build a lot of housing, but if we don't, if the government doesn't invest in more housing, we're never going to address that. The bottom end of the market is just not enough supply that we can create to do that. Second thing I would say is, even if we could find the places to build and the policies were in place, we actually don't have the capacity in the industry to deliver substantially more housing than we have been delivering over the past couple of decades. Right now, there's more housing units under construction than there ever have been, and we're still way below the supply targets that we're talking about. And all the contractors, all the engineers, all the architects, everyone's working flat out up until very recently due to things like interest rates. But we need to actually find a better way of delivering housing. And so to me, the only way that we're going to get there is through adopting innovations that allow us to build more quickly, more efficiently, and less expensive. So there's some really interesting emerging technologies in terms of the automation, industrialization of construction, which I think are critically important and the only way we're going to get to the solutions that we need.
Changes to building codes, even like the two staircase.
That would help, but I actually don't think building code is the problem either. These technologies are being built and deployed based on existing building codes.
Tara, do you want to weigh in?
I wanted to weigh in on the sort of the comment that Nate made about, the shopping mall model. And someone reminded me very helpfully, I might add, that, while the airport itself in the Downsview case is this very unique opportunity, and it was really great to hear sort of Derek lay out the various layers and the intentionality behind the sort of development of it. There are probably smaller sites, still not airport size, but not single, not a single plot of land, where those kinds of models could be applied. And my colleague sort of pointed to, those sort of either the strip malls that are in sort of lower density, not built up parts of this, the suburban fabric of the Toronto region. That would be sort of one potentially. Some of these car dealerships, other places where there's, potentially not the highest and best use of existing suburban land, where you're not clearing out single family homes to replace, with some other kind of model of development, but there might actually be some really creative ways to use some of our existing land base that may not be being optimized the way it could be, without, while still not encroaching on employment land, which is another thing that sort of we have to circle around and thinking about where we can densify or build additional development.
Yeah, I've got my own last question, and then I'll switch to ones in the chat. But something I've long been thinking about is, it's coming from political science before switching to geography and my planning specialty now. But I'm always curious about this intersection of housing and politics as we see it now in a variety of different ways. But it's something that Nate brought up and Derek brought up as well, of a lot of people derive their wealth from housing as an investment. And in that sense, they might be focused on the short-term maximization of those individual assets to gain wealth. But that sort of comes at odds with a need to do more coordinated types of planning beyond the Downsview site, like Nate was saying, of how do we encourage good growth beyond Downsview into Toronto's neighborhoods or other neighborhoods around the region. So it came up in some research we were doing where we know quite a bit about integrated transportation and land use planning, but how do we tell those stories better so that they get enacted at the policy level and they get broader public support? Like, how do we tell neighborhoods that if you think longer term beyond the maximization of your individual asset, that we can make a better community and grow your wealth over a longer time frame, not unlike what Derek was saying of how they approach the Downsview development.
Yeah, I think what you're asking, Chris, and what the big issue is people's confidence in government, right? To be as good at optimizing as a single developer like Northcrest could be. And there's lots of reasons why we might think, government, various levels of government have been captured by interest groups that mean that will not happen. And I think then it's, anytime you allow a big development to happen in your neighborhood, you're taking a risk that things are going to change for the worse, and you're putting your faith in people that to regulate this and keep eyes on it that maybe don't have the neighborhood's best interest in mind. So it's not surprising that people in single family home neighborhoods tend to be against development nearby. You've got to convince them somehow that development is going to make their neighborhood higher amenity. I think I think Tara is right that these sort of sprawl repair opportunities might be the best way forward there, in that, you know, people don't like having a strip mall next to their house either, and maybe densifying that and making it housing with maybe a little park or something is one way of having that happen, and having the land use planning and zoning regime encourage that might be something government can do that's a little bit hands-off to help that sort of thing happen.
You know, that question falling flat. Just how do we convince neighborhoods to densify is really the core of it, but we don't know.
I see
Really
a
not
lot
a
of signs.
straightforward answer.
Yeah, fair enough. Here's an interesting one about affordability in the region and policy levers. How much do tax regimes impact affordability and the price of land? And it comes up often of things like a land value tax. Is that in any way any kind of a solution that that could be weighed as one of the toolkits?
Absolutely. You know, and then there's public information about this, so I'm not saying anything that isn't out there already, but about a third of the cost of a new unit of housing is some form of government taxes or fees. Now the provinces tried to do things, something that Nate was referencing, that as an example, they've said you can't charge development charges for affordable housing units. But the reality is, in the way the math works, it's more of a whack-a-mole, so that if you take the development charge away from affordable housing, it just pops up on the market housing. So you're overall still charging the same amount of fees. And you know, that's it's not really a criticism, it's just a fact. So absolutely, that is one lever that governments have. But the reality is, this is I don't even know what the right, it's billions or hundreds of billions. I mean, it's a problem that kind of defies wrapping your head around, because the cost of delivering just one unit of affordable housing in the absence of government intervention is hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, in order to solve the problem, it really is only the federal and provincial governments. The city municipalities just do not have the financial resources to really move the needle. And up to now, the provincial and federal governments have just not been willing to allocate the amount of dollars that are required to actually deliver significant amounts of affordable housing.
I think there's another point about affordable housing that is a bit maybe not politically correct to say, but I'll say it anyways, and that is that in order to provide a lot of affordable housing, it has to be lower quality than new housing, because the cost of providing new housing is just high. And so either you spend a lot of government money per unit doing it, and you can't provide very many units, as Derek just said, or you kind of make developers build it and ration it out to very few people, and have excess demand of low-income people for these units. So I think the only way to make good progress on this is to have a way of building housing that's cheaper and lower, which means lower quality in some way. And that's just the way it is. Otherwise, I don't think there's really any hope of solving the affordable housing issue. Especially in a city like Toronto with such rapid population growth, where all the new private developer housing is sort of by construction has to be oriented towards the higher income segment of the market. It can't be oriented towards lower income people, because that wouldn't justify building it.
I wouldn't say I disagree, but I would add a caveat to what Nate said. That is I think the prevailing view, but I go back to my earlier comment about just finding a better way of delivering housing. It is just too expensive to build a unit of housing, regardless of whether it's market or affordable. And it just shouldn't be that way. There's no, we build the same way that we have for the last 70, 80 years. There's lots of stats about how basically the construction and development sector have basically zero productivity gains over that period of time. There needs to be a better way of delivering the units in the first place, which should include faster, cheaper, better. But there isn't really a lot of investment being made in that. There are now some companies in that space, which is really exciting. But one way governments could get involved is to actually help fund research and development into lowering the construction costs, improving the adoption technologies that will actually deliver all housing in a way that's faster, cheaper, better.
I agree with you on that. Yeah.
Tara, if you want to jump in.
I do want to jump in on a couple of things. I mean, I think, I was thinking a lot about this, sort of, what's the role for the public sector, and the public sector and government, all three levels, and some of these extra agencies too, are sometimes at odds with one another. And we sort of step back a minute and forget about today and think about sort of the history on the government involvement in housing, which has really evolved and changed over time. And so we think about some of the public or social housing or subsidized housing that was built at different points in time. It was built in places that made more sense from a sort of an accessibility to transit perspective, and it was of a reasonable kind of quality, which we, the argument being here is that that's not the possibility. I don't want to get caught up in a discussion about the quality of housing, but I do want to get caught up in a conversation about what governments can and can't do, because I think there are, sometimes governments are at odds with itself. And I'm thinking, we have colleagues at the University of Toronto who are thinking a lot about social purpose real estate, and there's a lot of public land in the city that's, dedicated to various things, whether it's providing municipal services or community services, transit, and in a lot of cases there is airspace above those that if redeveloped could be used for other things, whether it's centralizing services or whether it's adding in affordable housing units. I know that at the School Cities is an initiative right now thinking about, can we add affordable housing on top of a fire station? That sounds like maybe way outside of most people's headspace and box, but in fact it is possible, and they are doing it. So there are these smaller ways in which I think the public can intervene and support the development of affordable housing, which may not undermine these other issues. So I think that I think there is a possibility for quality. We don't have to sacrifice that, but I don't really want to go down that path. But I do think that there are other ways the public sector itself can be far more creative, both in supporting the provision of affordable housing, being a partner in that, and also incenting the private sector to do so as well.
So just to be clear, when I say quality, I mostly mean size, like square footage. That's, I think we all agree that you got to have, washrooms and kitchens and things. But, durable
housing.
Yeah, but I think it's like, if you look at where lower income people live, they live in older housing, and it's a challenge that Toronto doesn't have a lot of older housing because it's a relatively new city, and that's hard. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass to Judy just to wrap up because we've hit 5 o'clock already, but I just find these things are too short. Got you on mute, Judy.
Start sharing your screen and funny things happen, right? Anyway, thanks everybody for joining us. An hour does goes quickly, but we know that you're very happy. So it's my job now to thank everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks to our panelists. And we hope that we'll see everybody again. This was the fourth in a series exploring the way forward. We'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about decarbonizing transportation, and 2 weeks after that to talk about tackling congestion. You'll find all these advertised on our website. You'll get reminders if you subscribe to our weekly newsletter. You can subscribe to the newsletter on the website, and you can always find out more by contacting us. So let me just say once again, thank you everybody very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. And thank you.